My dear friends and budding historians, thank you for joining me today with a very short, I hope, talk about Renaissance warfare. I'll try not to ramble too much. Um, but if you're in my Western civilization class, you're going to want to go ahead and get out that PowerPoint called Ren War, and it will kind of give you some of the images and some of the bullet points of what I'm about to speak to you about, which is kind of this, it's almost, it might almost seem like counterintuitive or paradoxical perhaps, that the Renaissance led to an intense changes in warfare and a increase in warfare and an increase in destruction. So I say it's a paradox because the Renaissance has this feeling to our eyes as a time of learning, beauty, beautiful artwork, advances in music, advances in sciences. But at the same time, you'll see there were a lot of really horrible wars fought in this time. So our first slide actually reviews something we spoke about a little bit in terms of the High Middle Ages, which is that the way of making war changed. Before the Renaissance, very typically warfare in Western Europe was fought by mounted shock combat of horsemen, right? Cavalry who would ride in and so these are the knights, right? They're riding in with their massive swords and just cutting the people down. So that's the combat strategy. And sieges of fortressed castles. So that's when we think of the Middle Ages, we often think of castles, and that's why, because these were the warfare strategy. So the only way you can keep out those knights on horseback is to build a big fort. And then if you are the knight on horseback, what you do is you besiege the castle or the walled city and you starve them out. Renaissance changes all of this with some of the technologies I spoke about in our previous meeting, but some of the technologies were something called a pike, which is a huge, long, sharp stick. So your pikemen have this, we're talking like 8-10 feet or longer, very thick, sharpened stick that the pikemen could set that stick in the ground really fiercely, and then if you try that horseman shock combat, your horses can't come. You'll get all just jammed up on the pikes. The longbow was a really important technology. The longbow originated in Wales, and the English adopted it around the 1290s. So you've kind of seen this in Robin Hood, but it's a massive bow. And because it's so huge, that means the projectile, which is also bigger, can maybe go a lot further. There's a lot more power there. And the longbowmen were so well trained that they could get off many shots. So they're getting off maybe even more than a shot a minute, easily. Okay, and starting in the 1300s, we see gunpowder weaponry. So this is guns, cannon, artillery, things like that. And these technologies were really developed elsewhere, and the Europeans were kind of one of the last people to get them in the Eastern Hemisphere. But the Europeans added to the technology as well and developed it for their own terrain. To sum up those changes that I spoke about in technology, what that all means, this is the significance, right? All those changes are significant because it made that wealthy fighting class of knights much less important. So we see a real drop in the kind of practical status of wealthy knights who own horses. They're still useful, they still use them, but suddenly there's a growing use of infantry and investment in infantry and of training the infantry to be maybe semi-professional or professional soldiers. So infantry and artillery are more important than your knights. Okay, one place this warfare is seen is in the Italian city-states. Italy during this time period was a geographic idea, but there was no country called Italy. There was a bunch of different countries. Some of them were just sort of one city, and that's called a city-state, you'll remember. And most of the city-states were controlled by a group of elites, or maybe like a little oligarchy. In some cities it was one family, the most famous, the Medici family, of course. And the Medici were in Florence. Okay, so there's a lot of vying for power in these different states, and then the Pope is there as well. So there's the church trying to exert his political power over those states and over political events that were happening in the states, and then all these states were having war with one another. Okay, so main idea, Italy was all broken up into many different countries and will remain so until the 1870s. Okay, but I want to take the second part of this lecture to talk about something called the 100 Years' War. This was a war, so it was a series of conflicts, probably more accurate to say, between France and England. What we see is that from the kind of broken up, decentralized states of the Middle Ages, monarchs are gradually getting more successful at consolidating their power under a more centralized kind of administration. And I don't want to overstate this, but there's an increasing idea that the king is the king of a certain territory rather than the king of a certain group of people. That doesn't go away completely, but it's something that kind of is gradually starting to happen in the 1300s and 1400s. But there's a dispute over these territories, as you can see from the map, that, again, it's kind of similar to Italy. There's no country called France, really. There's a pink blob in the middle, and the rest of it belongs to someone else. Orange, a lot of that brown area was England, and a lot of the rest of it was just independent territories or semi-independent territories. Okay, there's a succession dispute when the monarch of France dies, because there's a couple of different nephews who each have a claim to the throne through their heritage. So they go to war over it. England is very successful from the start, particularly by using that longbow pictured there. They're more centrally organized than the French, and they're able to mobilize a more kind of professional, trained force. Okay. England does suffer some setbacks when Joan of Arc comes along and kind of rallies the people and leads the army. But in a way, you can also see Joan of Arc as really, as amazing as she was about 16, 17 when she started on her campaigns and her leadership of the army. She was from a peasant family in France who believed that God had given her this task to unite the French and drive out the English. So the idea that she's the one leading the army could be interpreted to suggest what a mess France was in. Like, why is this even happening? Okay, to put it in some perspective, can you imagine a 18-year-old leading our troops against an enemy, right? That's a shocking thing to contemplate, no matter how talented the individual might be. So it can be suggestive that France is really trying the Hail Mary pass, as it were. And there's a lot of allies who get involved in these wars between France and England at different times, particularly Flanders, which is kind of where Belgium is today. They're really tied into England through trade, so they don't want to see a powerful France take them over. Okay, to sum up the Renaissance warfare, we see a growth of infantry armies and a decline in the prestige of knights, particularly a decline in the idea that the knights are soldiers and that's what they're all about. So the nobility has to kind of reinvent itself. They used to be those who fight, and now they need to find a new reason of being. Another thing is that you begin to see the first inklings of a kind of nationalistic style patriotism, where, particularly in France and England, where people become more and more connected to the idea that they are part of a nation of people who are like them. Okay, again, I don't want to overstate this because there's still the idea of loyalty to your king, but this is just the first inklings of saying, you know, with Joan of Arc, of saying, you know, we are French, we're going to band together as French people against the English, and same with England. Okay, I want to leave you with some movie recommendations, one of which is Henry V, which is a play by Shakespeare, which really kind of shows you the war strategies very well, and it shows you that leadership of the king, and it shows the banding together of the different groups into something that can be like almost like a nation of the British. Okay. Thank you so much for joining me today.